Okay, we're going to talk about week 5, which is property distribution. And in a nutshell, there are a few different ways that property is distributed on divorce. I'm going to go back and take a look at week 4 to see whatever I can supplement from a video standpoint, but at least we're back on track with week 5 in week 5. So property distribution. So when people get married, you remember that they can combine their property, and you learned about 2 different ways that that can happen in a community state and in a common law state. And so that's how property is owned when people are married. It's how it's owned together. It's different from how it is split up on divorce. And those 2 different kinds of states, the community property state and the common law state, can be related to the ways that we distribute it, or you could be like Indiana and have a completely different system of how that happens. So there's 2 main ways that we split up property on divorce. Those are either typically 50-50, each spouse gets 50% of the property, or what we call equitable distribution. And equitable distribution is what's fair. In a given situation, 50-50 property distribution might not be fair. If you have a situation, what 50-50 was designed to do was to protect stay-at-home moms. Specifically, to protect women who stayed home and raised children. Because what would happen in an equitable distribution state is, well, it's fair that the husband gets more of the property because the husband earned it all. All the wife did was stay home and raise children. And that not only minimizes the contribution of parenting, contribution of household work, but it also puts women in a really bad position historically when divorce would happen and they would be left with nothing. So equitable distribution changes that automatic 50-50 scheme, because now what might be fair is not protecting women as much, because historically we were protecting women who did not work outside the house. And now so many more women do work outside the house that a 50-50 split might still be fair, but it might not be. And so here's the example of that. In an equitable distribution state, we look at literally what's fair. So let's say you have the situation where you have no children, so nobody's staying at home taking care of children, but you have a wife who works outside the house, or a husband or 2 wives, doesn't really matter. So you've got one person who works outside the house, and the other person is not disabled, is not staying at home taking care of kids, but they cannot keep a job. Let's say they've been in and out of maybe legal trouble, maybe they are just the kind of person that does not deal well with authority, and so they have not kept a job during the entirety of, let's say, a 5-year marriage. And in that 5 years, the other person has supported them financially. The one spouse could work, but they don't. They either choose not to, or they keep getting fired, or they are, an entrepreneur who's not doing very well, or maybe they're in college, and maybe they're not even doing well in college, but they're just not providing. They're not contributing to the finances of that marriage. In a 50-50 state, it wouldn't matter. They would get 50% of all of the marital property. And typically these 50-50 states are community property states. So they would take their separate property with them when they went. But in these situations, typically that person may not have a lot of separate property, or maybe neither one of the spouses has separate property. So in a situation like that, where we're not in a traditional home and the mom stays home with the kids, and so we need to value her contribution to the family, even if it isn't financial. But we have this situation, a different situation, where one person just doesn't contribute to the family, financially speaking. In an equitable distribution situation, we can adjust the percentage. 60-40, 70-30. There's not even necessarily specific guidelines on percentage. That's just kind of how judges might do it. But we look at what's fair. And what an equitable distribution state can do is look at things differently in terms of what I just explained, who's contributing, and look at things like inheritances, businesses, and retirement differently. So what is different about this? So let's say in a 50-50 state, we have the husband does all the work, makes all the money for the household. There are no children. The wife just can't keep a job, chooses not to keep a job, what have you. And in year 2 of the marriage, the husband's father dies and he is entitled to $1 million inheritance. Is it fair for the wife to get $500,000 from that inheritance because they're living in a 50-50 state? Not only do we look at what's fair in terms of what each party brings in to a marriage, but we also look at what's fair in terms of other outside things. An inheritance, typically it seems more fair that the inheritance would go towards the person who lost a loved one. Traditionally, that inheritance was supposed to protect your family and your extended family and your grandchildren. But in a more modern situation where there may not be any grandchildren, it might seem less fair to split that inheritance up between the two parties. Businesses. So let's say in a relationship, we've got let's say the wife is a lawyer and that lawyer has built a law practice, and she was in law school when they got married, and they get married and she builds that law practice herself. By the time they get divorced 10 years later, and again, no children, no stay-at-home parenting, she has equity. She's bought a building and she's got 3 employees. And should the spouse then be required to get 50% of that business because it was all grown within the context of the marriage? And again, it's not this person staying home so that they can help the other person, by taking care of the family so that the other person is free to grow their business. The other person didn't have any part of it. Now, let's switch that up. Let's say the wife is a lawyer and grows her business, and the husband is a paralegal in that business. And maybe he does all the payroll. Maybe he does research. Maybe he is an administrative assistant for her for the entirety of the growing of that business. Now, is it fair to give him a share of the business? Yes. Is it fair to give him a 50% share of the business? Maybe, maybe not. Those are the things that equitable distribution is designed to assist with. What is fair in this situation? So when we're talking about inheritances, we're talking about businesses, when we're talking about retirement, next week, we're going to talk about a quadro, which is how you essentially split up a retirement account. But let's say people get married later in life and it doesn't last very long, but during the course of the marriage, that person retires and starts drawing from retirement. Would it be fair for that person's spouse in a short marriage at the end of life to get half of that person's retirement account, half of that person's life insurance policy if their child dies or something along those lines? Many times now, historically, 50-50 community property states, and again, we're talking about community property in terms of dissolution as opposed to ownership, seemed more fair. It protected people, mainly women, who stayed home to raise a family so that their partner could work. It doesn't seem quite as fair now for all of the examples that I've given you. And so equitable distribution is how we manage that. Now, this is just who gets what, who's entitled to how much. And it really is when we look at a 50-50 state, we look at the percentage. We take a look at the debts. Okay, because when we distribute property in a marriage or in a divorce. We're going to distribute both debt and property. Now, I'll give you another example. In a 50-50 state, let's say that one spouse has a hidden credit card and racks up $100,000 worth of debt that the other spouse doesn't know about and didn't consent to. In a 50-50 state, who gets that debt? Gets split down the middle. Fair? No. It is not fair that that someone could amass a bunch of debt outside of the consent or the knowledge of the other party and then obligate the other party to pay for half of it. Now, there are some statutes that may, in a given 50-50 jurisdiction, bear on that, innocent spouse kind of exceptions, but it isn't fair. Equitable distribution might then say, you got the debt without permission, without knowledge, you pay for the debt because that's fair, because we are going to distribute both the debt and the property in a given situation. Okay, how does this happen, practically speaking? So let's say, I'm going to give you a few examples here. Let's say we have a situation where you have a husband and wife and they're both working and they make relatively equal incomes. They both came to the marriage with nothing. They have no property that they came to the marriage with. But we each have equal incomes and they've had equal incomes and contributed basically equally to the marriage while they were married. And so in either a 50-50 state or in an equitable distribution state, it's going to seem fair to split the property down the middle, right? And when you don't have a lot of property, that's pretty easy. You take your car, I take my car, we divide up personal property, we go our separate ways. Where this becomes difficult is where we have property that is not easily dividable, all right? So let's talk about a home. Most of you probably understand how homes are financed, and most people don't take, $200,000 and plunk it down with a realtor and buy a house outright. Most people have a mortgage on their house. So when you are paying off a mortgage, most of that payment, let's say you have a $700 payment a month, most of that payment is going to be interest to the bank up front in your marriage, and a little bit of it is going to go into what we call equity in a home. If you've never heard of this before, that majority of the payment goes to the bank, and that little bit becomes equity. And that equity is what you own in the home. Over time, in a traditional mortgage, the equity portion grows and the interest portion shrinks. Okay. So let's say, so the equity is what you actually own in the home if you don't own it outright because you have a mortgage on it. So you own whatever you've paid into the equity. Okay. Let's say you've got this estate and people are getting divorced, and we're going to do a 50-50 split because it's what's fair. And that home has, let's say, $10,000 worth of equity. So that's the money you have socked away in the home. The home is still got $100,000 left to pay on the mortgage. So how do we split this up? We're not going to split up the $100,000 because that's what's still left to pay on it. Let's say they haven't been married very long and it was $110,000 and they've paid into the home, and now they have just this $10,000 of equity and there's $100,000 left on the mortgage. There's a bunch of different ways, and this is where we kind of get into the artistry, let's say, of equitable distribution, because there's not a whole lot of guidance on what can or should be done in this particular situation. We've got $10,000 equity, and let's say the other assets of the house, let's say there's no debt. We're going to make it real easy. Your assignment's going to be more difficult, but we're going to make this easy. $10,000 equity. Two cars. And when we do evaluation, we're typically going to go with fair market value. The money that's gone into the mortgage is going to be the kind of the cost of living in the house so far. We're going to split up Based on fair market value, we've got 2 cars. Car 1 has a fair market value of $20,000. Car 2 has a fair market value of $15,000. So actually, let's change this because I'm not good at math and this will make it easier. So we've got 1 car fair market value of $20,000 and 1 car fair market value of $10,000. If the person who keeps the $20,000 vehicle, because let's say they were both marital property, and we'll talk about that in a second, keeps the car, they've now kept $20,000 of the estate, and the other person keeps the $10,000 plus the house, which has $10,000 in equity, they now have $20,000. That's a 50-50 split, right? That's about the easiest example I can get of how we do that practically. Is that going to happen in most cases? No, because in many cases, the person who typically drove this car is going to want to keep this car. The person who typically drove this car is going to want to keep the car. Maybe one person really wants the house. Maybe the other person doesn't. And so we've got all of these situations. And so let's take this $10,000 equity. What's another way that we can split it up? We can have a lump sum payment. So let's say if we think what's fair is to split this down the middle, and we've got, so it's $5,000 a piece, right? The person keeping the house can take $5,000 in a lump sum payment from, let's say, non-marital earnings or a savings account somewhere else or a retirement account or something, and give the other spouse $5,000, and they keep the house. So they walk away with 10, but they've paid for it. Essentially, they've split it up. Another thing that they can do is they can pay that over time. So let's say the person who keeps this house, let's say they keep the house with $10,000 equity, and there's no other assets in the estate. So there's nowhere else this $5,000 can come from to satisfy the other person. You can have a judgment where you get divorced and the property is split over time. So let's say this person who keeps the house is going to make $200 monthly payments to the other spouse until their share of this, their $5,000, is paid for. And so that can happen during the pendency of the divorce, because remember, once you get separated, that separation date, as you learned from the last discussion board, that separation date is meaningful. It, number one, can start the clock on your divorce. Number two, it stops the clock for the acquisition of marital property. So you get separated, and everything you acquire from that point forward is separate, even if the divorce is still pending. So the divorce is still pending. Your job, whatever money you're getting from your work, is now yours. It's not split half and half. And you can pay $200 a month towards the $5,000 that you owe the other person for their share of the equity in the home when you're going to keep the home. That can happen during the pendency of the divorce. It can also be part of the order. And if that person stops paying, then they're in contempt of court. So there are lots of different sort of creative things that judges can do to split up property fairly. Sometimes we can also sell the asset. So let's say there's $10,000 equity in this house, and neither one of them really wants it. We sell it, we split the proceeds at the end. And that's kind of the easy way to do it. But lots of times we don't want to do that. Recently, if there's a recession during the middle of COVID, no one wants to sell their house. So it makes much more sense if we can find a way to distribute those proceeds evenly and equally beyond just selling it and then splitting the proceeds. Okay. This is where we're going to stop right now because we're running up on 20 minutes, and I will continue in a bit.